Hello and welcome to the first in the SunGuard 2020 webinar series on infrastructure as a service. And this one's entitled The Quick Win. We're joined today by a panel of experts. Firstly, Phil Laslett, who is Enterprise Cloud Specialist at SunGuard Availability Services. Kerry Partridge, who is European Business Development Manager for Unified Computing Systems at Cisco. And Chris Mellor, an established IT journalist who covers storage and allied technology for the Register. The format will involve 20 minutes of discussion, followed by a 10-minute Q&A session, during which our experts will be responding to questions from the audience. So, let's begin. Cloud infrastructure isn't an all-or-nothing proposition. A phased approach to migration can help organisations acclimatise. Would you say that's been your experience, Phil?
Yeah, absolutely, Kate. I mean, although it would be a wonderful thing to adopt cloud computing or infrastructure as service in a kind of like a big bang approach, the fact is, from my experience, is that it's definitely much more of a drip feed. It's looking at applications and business situations where you can benefit from taking on infrastructure, for example, as a service to solve certain problems, then cultivating that particular success story and using that throughout the business and champion it, because the fact is that whilst cloud computing can drive a lot of business benefits, there's also a lot of resistance to change because people are relinquishing control, and that can be something that can be challenging. So we're commonly seeing people adopting services in a small way, and then that's gradually growing throughout the business.
Kerry, is that your experience?
Yeah, I think post the economic downturn in 2008, 2009, as we came out of that recession, many companies were reappraising their investment criteria. And many of the organisations that traditionally would have been in the nothing category certainly didn't move to the all category, but moved to, well, what could I move over to a more flexible and more agile service, a cloud-like service? And we see that ever increasing now as people are starting to get more comfortable with that kind of service proposition.
I think it makes sense for any move for a business to move to any significant outside resource, be it banking services, advertising services to supply electricity or anything. You do it where it makes sense, and you do it step-by-step approach. You look for benefits from doing it and gradually move out towards them.
So, in that case, where best to start? What would be a soft point of entry into the cloud for an organisation who is looking to take this phased approach?
Well, I think the key thing to do is actually look more at the services that you're providing and actually look for circumstances where there can be business benefit from taking on cloud. For example, looking at situations where you've got potentially capital investments and moving to more of an OpEx model of work, or looking at time to market as well, where you get a significant business benefit from delivering that service quicker, or looking more from a flexibility point of view in terms of actually the characteristics of that service and if there is more known requirements for the future.
Okay, so in terms of that starting point then, what would be the kind of least demanding applications that might be seen as a low risk proposition?
Any self-contained kind of web service, I would probably say. There obviously is a lot of talk around looking at environments such as test and development, and it can very much be something that is a self-contained Windows or Linux application that you can move quite simply to infrastructure service and receive a lot of benefits from.
Yeah, I think there's some easy wins that you can make around services that are relatively easy, relatively simple, low availability things. But again, they're kind of a little bit commoditized in that space. So there are other things, particularly greenfield applications. VDI would be a classic example where they don't exist in many enterprises today. And it's something that you could put out there, even in a test dev environment, and then grow it up out of there. And again, it's looking at what applications could you put into that environment, which ones would you then take back into your own enterprise, and which ones would you leave and sustain in that environment. Yeah, and that will be different for many different companies.
Yeah, I think a soft entry, as well as reassuring you that you can get into the cloud safely, should also give you a benefit from doing so. There should be an impact from doing it, a good impact from doing it that you can build on afterwards.
And presumably the inherent scalability of the cloud would lend itself well to that kind of application.
Well, certainly, fundamentally, one of the advantages of taking on infrastructure as a service is the fact that you have that scalability, that ability to flex as you need to. whether it be on seasonal demand or because you fundamentally are growing that service exponentially as a business. It inherently is a key facet of cloud computing, which makes it fundamentally good at delivering business benefits for a very wide-ranging number of applications.
So let's look at some other applications potentially. What about something like Processor Flex, where organisations are running very complex models or simulations and they just simply don't have the processing capability in-house to accommodate that?
So I think there's a great position for that if you look at some of the banking applications with Monte Carlo simulation. If you just want to run a one-off simulation, there's a good position for doing that. But they tend to be very, very processor intensive at that point for a very short period of time. It's difficult to acquire services in that background when it's always temporary. How do you put an SLA behind that? What happens if somebody else is using that capacity? And I think there's a fair balance between processor flex and applications that are going to sustain there for a while. And again, the big balance is how much do you need and when do you need it? Is it predictable? Is it non-predictable? Versus availability of skill set and the availability of getting a good quality SLA that supports the business. And again, a lot of that, if you look at the more open public cloud services, they're great, but they don't have an SLA. And for enterprises and businesses that need that SLA, need that level of trust and confidence, the SLA then becomes the important thing.
Absolutely fundamental.
I think Processor Flex is a great way of using the cloud because that's part of the cloud's intrinsic nature, I think, the ability to dial up resources and dial them down when you've finished. And if you don't use an outside resource for Processor Flex, then you have to buy the servers in-house. And that means they're sitting there the rest of the year underutilised. That's solid cash, not earning its keep. It's a bad idea inherently, and the cloud is the answer to that.
And I think actually this is a really good example of where there's a clear demarcation between kind of public cloud services and enterprise cloud services. Fundamentally, there are many different facets and flavours of cloud computing, and there's a place for all of them. This is a really good example of where that burstability, that incredibly large flex is the key decision point and buying criteria for some people, whereas for other people it is more around having those, like Kerry said, those SLAs, the location of data and that inbuilt security, which you get more from an enterprise proposition.
And presumably things like peak and seasonal workloads would come under that category as well, where you would have servers standing idle for the majority of the year otherwise.
Yes, I mean, fundamentally, that's an excellent use, as I said before, from cloud computing. We have many clients who've got web services, and they do marketing campaigns and flexing and increasing their resource pool and their capability allows them to cope with that seasonal demand without that investment in capital in the underlying infrastructure. It's an absolute key part of any proposition and can help deliver a really good total cost of ownership because you haven't got that investment.
Reminds me of the post office in the UK. Christmas time, work for students. They're not needed the rest of the year.
Absolutely. So those are things where we're talking about a temporary workload, but what about something on a more permanent basis?
Well, from a SunGuard point of view, that's kind of where we fit because we focus on pre-production workloads. So cloud computing and infrastructure service, a lot of people putting their toe in the water and considering it something that was more for test and dev. But we've seen financial services organisations, public sector organisations with quite heavy requirements on security and taking on more production applications because they want to leverage the benefits you can get from cloud computing. And I think the key part around this is an awareness in the marketplace and an understanding that you need to have things like appropriate levels of security, manageability and availability. From a security point of view, yes, you need to keep sensitive data in a secure environment and protect that same NHS IL impact level 3 and 4, but you also need to look at elements of those services that may be web-based that can be put into a cloud-compiled environment and not stifle innovation by locking things down within an inch of their life.
Absolutely. Would you agree with that, Kerry?
Yeah, I think if you look at the difference between permanent and temporary, there are different facets that people begin to look at. So if you look at the temporary side, I completely agree with Chris. You either have no option because you don't physically have the capacity, or it may not be economically viable. When you tend to look at permanent applications, the reasons to maybe put them out to the cloud may be totally different. It may be because that vendor has a huge level of experience and excels in that particular area, or it may be something as simple as you don't have the skill set, or you don't consider that as a core skill of your own company, and as a result, you want to focus on what you're good at, and then put things like that out to a vendor like SunGuard, where that is their core skill, and they can add value to what you're doing without increasing your cost. And again, it comes back to what Chris has said. You need to do this for a benefit to your business.
I'm reminded of Nicholas Carr's book about Big Switch. And this is we're in the middle of a transition to utility computing. And I think the single main benefit of it is that a cloud service provider can buy, operate and provide IT resources to enterprises far more cheaply and far more dynamically than enterprises can do it themselves. And that's not going to change. I think the ratio in proportion towards a cloud service provider is going to improve as time goes on.
Absolutely. So if organisations are evaluating cloud infrastructure at the moment, possibly many of those are already utilising software as a service, and that is almost a kind of a paddling in the shallow end of the proposition. How do you think software as a service fits as a soft point of entry?
Well, software as a service has been probably the single biggest area where there's been exponential growth over the last few years, because you have some very obvious example of that, where you're fundamentally getting a service and getting it delivered to you without any responsibility apart from focusing on the application. From a SunGuard point of view, what we've seen is this shift from the benefits people have seen from that wanting to be applied to maybe more traditional workloads. So large instances, for example, of SAP, where they can sit on cloud infrastructure. That infrastructure is delivered at an OPEX expense. The customer can wrap around the management of that and deliver that back to the workforce as a service, kind of from a service catalogue-based viewpoint and in line with, for example, ITIL processes. So software as a service does have a place, but there's also a significant number of other applications which you can deliver and have the same benefits from, but need to be delivered in a different manner from an infrastructure as a service platform.
So what you're effectively saying is then it's not really a technology issue, this is, gentlemen, about a business issue.
Absolutely, it's about the business requirement. Is that something that's core and inherent to what you do? I mean, we were talking about temporary workloads earlier. We see many organisations talking about this concept of we'll own the base and we'll rent out the spike. Or there are certain business processes that they're prepared to put out to a cloud or even some kind of third-party operation because they don't consider it as core competency of their own business. And again, it's important that companies understand, you're not probably going to put everything out there, but what makes economic and business sense to be able to put out in the cloud. And there's usually many options that most people have, but it's not necessarily something they perhaps feel immediately comfortable or can control at that moment in time. So there are lots and lots of different options, I think, that people should consider as to how they start to move into a cloud-type infrastructure, because it will happen.
We've got the technology available for moving into the cloud now. When or why should you do it? And there's got to be a reason for doing it. It's got to be a good reason.
I think we also find that whilst the technology under the hood is absolutely critical, it is not the only thing to be took into account. The success of adoption of cloud services is based upon a lot more than that.
So we've looked at temporary applications, permanent applications, which are relatively low risk and manageable. Is that the solution, or do you actually think that there's a better way of a company making its initial foray into the cloud?
I think there are two ways of looking at this. You can go for a small application which has a phenomenally big impact, and the reward from doing that is so massive that there's a halo effect that spreads out to everything else, and you automatically want to move everything else to the cloud. Or you can take a broader approach, and overall there's a big impact from doing this broader approach, but it's not so massive for individuals concerned that they may not actually see much change in their working life at all, but the business sees a change in its working life. You've got to take an approach, I think, which gives you a big impact from doing it, so you get confidence from doing it, you get confidence in the supplier, and you think, yes, this is something we can build on, this is something we can go forward with.
So you mean start with a workhorse?
Well, it could be.
I think you need to look at both. If there is a workhorse or a net new application there that's relatively large and relatively chunky, there is no reason, for all the reasons that Chris gave earlier, why it can't be put into the cloud. There are some phenomenal skill sets out there that can do that operation for you and potentially release your IT staff and your business staff to do things that drive your own business forward. That doesn't always exist. Those lovely greenfield environments aren't always there. So even if you don't have one of those immediately available to you, I think you should still consider other areas and begin to play with cloud so you get comfortable that you can trust and rely on the cloud, that you can understand how SLAs work around that, so that when you get the opportunity to do that and it makes business and commercial justification to you, you're ready to be able to move into that environment, because there are substantial advantages in doing it.
And ultimately, it's not looking at a particular style of application and saying that should be in the cloud. It's looking at making changes at the appropriate time. And for most businesses, they will have in their organisation, like Kerry said, net new applications that are coming on board. Like Chris said, they may have larger applications that are coming up for upgrade. And it's looking for those crucial changes. So looking whether there be a change in the underlying infrastructure, a change from an OS perspective, or maybe an application upgrade, and looking at different options on how to host that, and then wrapping that all up into what is the total cost of ownership of doing this. And that should be what you base your decision upon in terms of what you move as your first foray into the cloud.
So really you're looking for something where you can make the biggest business impact and demonstrate the viability of the model.
Absolutely. I mean, this is all about reducing cost. And when I say cost, I mean total cost of ownership. This is all about helping your business become more agile, dynamic, and competitive as well. And this is about leveraging the new technologies and capabilities that are there to facilitate business change. It's not about doing something for the sake of it. If businesses are stagnant, then there is absolutely no reason to change things. But when that change happens, there's now, with cloud computing, a whole array of different angles to go that can really give you a lot of an incredible return on investment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think times are hard. Times are going to get harder for business, and if they could take 10% out of their IT cost with no diminution in service, and perhaps with an increase in service levels, then why wouldn't they do it? And the cloud and the technology that enables us to move things to the cloud is the enabler for that.
So, gentlemen, what's coming out of the discussion effectively is that the best starting point to take advantage of the cloud isn't something that's low risk, undemanding or obscure, used by a tiny minority within the enterprise, but actually something more resource hungry, relied upon by more people, and something where it demands the levels of security and availability that are offered nowadays by cloud providers under the assurance of an SLA.
Yes, I mean, two key points. 2 points are don't look at just the smaller applications. Look at your whole array of the services you deliver, because they absolutely could be your key wins. And the success that you will get from the applications will not be based upon the technology that you get. We're based upon the capability of the service provider and the consultative approach that you take to how will this actually impact culturally on my business.
That's great, thank you very much indeed. That concludes the panel discussion, and we're going to move on now to some questions from our audience. The first one is about the loss of control that some people may anticipate from having had direct control over their estate and then relinquishing that to a third-party provider. What would you say in response?
Okay, we commonly see that as being a question that we have is the concern about relinquishing control. What does this mean to me? From a SunGuard point of view, to give a real-world example, we offer a kind of fully managed service where we will manage the operating system and patch the operating system to take away that menial task. However, we don't take away access, for example, to the OS, and also the customer retains control and ownership from a point of view of what is patched and when. So I think it sometimes that concern is based upon not totally knowing actually what is meant by moving to infrastructure service or cloud computing. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think people tend to have, if they only run their own environment, they may have a number of brilliant IT staff that they implicitly trust in. And when you move something out to the cloud, do I know that same level of individual is in the cloud? Which is why I think it's important to test it, but that shouldn't be a prohibitor for putting a large, meaningful application out there, which is why I'd encourage to test and look at both of those sides. Again, the maturity of the cloud and what we can do with cloud and the kind of infrastructure that's being built out, are absolutely designed for taking this kind of infrastructure, and you need to learn to trust in that where it's relevant and meaningful to the business.
I don't think in principle there's anything new here from a business using a service like banking or car fleet supply or anything else like that. I think the onus is on the service provider, first of all, to provide the level of service,
Absolutely.
the constancy of it, the transparency, and to give the customer the control over the bits and pieces of it as well. And if service providers can do that and the technology works, then I think the move to the cloud is going to be pretty much unstoppable.
Pretty compelling stuff. The next question we have here, we're under increasing cost pressures. Can I expect to reduce my costs?
Yes is the answer, but again, it's looking at things at a granular level. It's looking at total cost of ownership. And one of the common subjects that I talk about with customers in here is around the requirement to reduce kind of run and maintain costs. You know, you hear statistics, 60% or more businesses are on keeping business running as usual. By allowing and giving them some of those tasks, such as the management of operating systems or antivirus, the control around the virtualization infrastructure, to a service provider that is managing hundreds of other customers, can mean that will cost you a lot less than obviously doing it yourself. So you can reduce costs, but the crucial point is looking at it as a total cost of ownership point of view. And secondly, doing it when the business change and the reason is there that makes sense. Don't, for example, move an application to infrastructure service when you've literally bought a new kit for that application. Do it at a time, for example, maybe when the life cycle of that infrastructure is coming to an end.
The answer should always be yes. I guess the big things that we'd encourage our end users to look at is if you're using a temporary service, which typically is at a slightly premium cost, as that becomes more persistent, look at, maybe you move to a contracted service at that stage. The other big things are, by out-tasking things, where this is set, and you've got great vendors like SunGard offering these services, they're there because they run them very efficiently at a very high level of utilisation. That should always reduce cost. But the other side of that is it potentially releases capability in your own team to go off and innovate on behalf of your business, or maybe look at some of the other applications that exist within the business that perhaps could be updated or are going to be harder to move or transition over a period of time. And we've seen lots and lots of people use cloud as a way of releasing capability, time and resource in the data centre to go and do other things for the business. And that's a really, really good use of that and absolutely drives the business forward, as opposed to just changing a few things at the infrastructure level.
If you're going to decide to move to the cloud, particular applications on the basis of cost, you have to know what your own costs are. And that's not always the case. I think that a cloud service provider can help you there. You can jointly come up with a model that allows you to model your internal costs and what your costs are going to be if you move something to the cloud, and taking into account the released resources that you then have, and then make a clear decision whether it's worthwhile or not.
We have another question that's just come in. What are the fundamental differences between platform as a service and software as a service? Any takers?
Yeah, no problem at all. So the common three areas where people think cloud computing is software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. Software as a service is very much where you literally are delivered the application and you use that application and just focus on actually being productive. Examples of this in Salesforce, possibly email, such as Gmail, for example. At the other end of the scale, you've got infrastructure as a service, where you're being delivered effectively the infrastructure almost as a utility to be able to build upon that and build your IT function. And crucially, in the middle there is platform as a service. The way that I look at it is look at who are the users. The users of software as a service are traditional kind of like task workers like sales, HR, etc. Infrastructure as a service is your IT teams. Platform as a service is very much more like a development platform. So it gives you the tools, it allows you to spin up in a nice environment such as Salesforce.com, the ability to build your own applications, but from a fundamental platform with slightly less control there. Whereas infrastructure as a service gives you more control, but you have more responsibility, and therefore it can mean slightly more important at the time.
Thank you. Right, I think we've got time for just one last question, and this touches on something you mentioned, Kerry. I need to be able to better deploy my people and resources. Can cloud support this?
Yeah, what we've seen is a couple of things. Data centres have tended, or IT skill sets often get siloed. It can happen for very, very good reasons. And that then leads to kind of sequential behaviour. Teams maybe be out of synchronisation with each other. What we tend to find with clouds, it tends to bring everything together, because when you're looking at infrastructure software as a platform, you're kind of bringing all those skills together at a single point. So what we've tended to see with companies that have embraced cloud in general, it's by and large increased their skills as an IT department, and concentrated those skills as well, because they tend to be looking at, rather than feedering and watering activities, because that's a skill set of somebody else, their ability to do application development, application migration, and things that are beneficial for the business. And as a result, we've actually seen generically skill sets rise, and people doing, by and large, better, happier activities, because they're doing something that's not dull and repetitive. They're doing something that is genuinely beginning to automate or policy drive a business.
So some of the people I've talked to, they say that their IT department is more responsive to the lines of business, that they can entertain developments and initiatives from the lines of business that they couldn't entertain before because they're too busy fixing. You found the same thing?
I completely agree. We dealt with one customer where, as an output of moving to a kind of cloud theme provisioning platform, they actually ended up putting 2 of their existing IT staff into capacity planning with the business, and it really, really brought the business and the IT
It's not
department
about reducing
together.
headcount.
Absolutely. It's about using that headcount to do beneficial things for the business, and that really had a dramatic effect for them in that instance.
Yeah, we're seeing exactly the same things. The interesting thing is when you start to use more agile and dynamic ways of providing infrastructure, you take away certain tasks. You never know actually what you can achieve until you've done that, because most IT departments have got excellent skills in there. They're just being dulled down and restricted because they've got so many other activities to do. And by adopting infrastructure service, we're seeing people exponentially grow and reap lots of benefits they didn't even expect.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for ending on a very upbeat note. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for attending. We hope you found today's discussion informative. And a video of this webinar will be available to watch on demand on the 2020 Webinars website, which you'll find at www.2020webinars.com. And you can also sign up for further webinars in the series on the site. The next webinar will be the Business Case Roadmap, and that will be taking place at 2 p.m. GMT on Thursday, the 8th of March. So we hope you'll be joining us there. Thank you very much and goodbye.